So this is the video that's going to tell you how to add value to your still life. And I am going to, this is a very basic tutorial for beginners. And this is not using any sort of studio lighting. I actually have a little technique that I teach my students that tends to work pretty well when you're just getting started. So generally in studio settings, an artist will set up their still life. They'll put their objects in front of them, and then they will put some sort of a spotlight on those objects so that they can see lights and darks. We don't necessarily have the luxury of having spotlights or the space to leave things still for very long because we have to move them and live in the space that we're working. So I tell my students to choose a corner in the top and lightly draw a sun. Okay, this is going to be your imaginary spotlight shining down on this object. Okay, so you have to imagine that the light is hitting this object, and you also want to understand when you're starting with value, each time you create a shape, these shapes have to be treated separately. Okay, so down here, for example, this is one shape which is different from this shape, and even though this is one whole water bottle, we're going to treat each section separately. Okay, so I'm going to start off, I'm going to get rid of my mechanical pencil at this point because mechanical pencil is hard and you don't actually want to use anything that's too hard when you're starting to shade. You also don't want to use anything too soft. So anytime you find something that says HB, that's pretty good because it's the center of the spectrum. Okay, now if you picture this little area sitting with the spotlight on it, you would imagine that the top of this object is going to be pretty light, and then as you get down it might get a little bit darker. You would also imagine that this corner would probably be the darkest because the spotlight is coming from here. So this might be a little lighter and it might get a little darker. So I always tell my students to grab your pencil with a fist, point up, and then scoot your finger so that you're holding your finger along the edge of the wood. And sometimes it's easier to turn your paper. But I always start in the darkest area. And we already established the fact that down towards the bottom of this shape, it's going to be the darkest. Okay? Now, as I move up, I have to gradually lighten my touch. And this is a very small shape, so it's going to happen pretty quickly. But you never want to see a harsh line where your dark ends and your medium begins, and then your medium ends and your light begins. You want it to change gradually. Where you do want to see a harsh line is where you're changing objects or changing shapes. So right along the top of this little tiny shape, I want this to be pretty light in value, okay? Because right down here, now we're on to a new shape. Let's start from the beginning. The spotlight's here. It's pretty bright up here. It's going to get darker, and it's going to get darker on a diagonal. This is going to be the darkest area. All along the bottom, just like we did that shape. All along the bottom of this shape is going to be dark. And along the top of this little shape, it's light. So that, remember this word, contrast, in my first video? That word is very important right now because that is what's going to show you the difference between shapes or objects. So this dark touching this light is helping the viewer to understand that they are separate parts. Okay? So I'm going to go along this because I know this is a very dark corner, a dark side. But as I get up, I am going to get a little lighter because the spotlight is probably going to start hitting this area. Let me turn my paper back. You may notice that I'm trying to use a curved sort of motion when I am shading right now because this bottle is a curve. If it were flat-sided, I would make my lines a little more straight. Now I'm just going to layer. Layering is great. When you layer your graphite, it's a gradual change. Like I said, you don't want it to change harshly. You don't want to see a line where your dark ends and your light or medium begins. Okay. If you got too dark or too light, don't worry about it. We're going to fix it in a little while. Okay, so let's leave it like that for now, and let's get on to the next shape. So the next shape is this right in here. Just like before, it's almost like a pattern. The bottom of this shape and this corner is going to become the darkest because it's farthest from the spotlight. So here I go again. I'm going to start in the corner here. I'm going to go along the whole bottom. I want that contrast, right? I want that light next to that dark. And I'm going to go up the side a little bit because this is darker. And now I'm softening my touch. Now I'm getting a little harder again because it's dark down here. I'm trying to stay in a curved motion as much as I can. And I'm lightening my touch. So you're starting to see a pattern, I hope. So you're going to just keep working in this way. I'm going to get dark in this corner. But don't get frustrated yet if yours isn't looking just like this. If you're a beginner artist and you haven't really perfected the shading gradually yet, it's okay, and that's why these tools exist. All these beautiful tools that we have are for ways to help artists blend. So I'm going to get my blending stump, and generally I like to start with my blending stump in the light areas first, because you'll notice your blending stump is going to start to get dirty, and the dirtier it gets, the dirtier it makes your light values, so your light values end up getting a little darker than you might have wanted them, and that's going to happen. And guess what? When it does, we have a kneaded eraser. Okay? What you want to try to make sure that you remember is that each of these shapes has to be treated separately. So at no point should I ever go from here into here and do this kind of a thing, because then you're going to lose that contrast. So down here, I didn't go into this shape. So I'm going to go down here and I'm going to blend this a little. Oh no, the contrast is going away. It's okay. Don't worry about it, because now you have this lovely tool, your kneaded eraser. I'm going to make it thin, and I'm going to go right along where I want that contrast again. And see that? It's like magic. So right along here, up in this top corner, this is the closest to my spotlight. Now I can widen this a little and drag this along. See that line? You don't want that. So now I'm going to gradually lift some of this graphite without making anything too harsh. And I can use my finger to sort of soften things. And then the last step would be to get your ebony pencil or a 6B pencil, a soft pencil, something that's going to help you really pop out those darks. So down here in this corner and along this edge. I am going to darken that. And the cool thing about this softness of this pencil is I don't have to actually press as hard to make it show up as dark as if I were using this pencil. So it's a little bit easier on your hands. Your hands get tired. And I'm moving up the edge, and maybe I want to give it a little outline. Down in this corner, get it dark again. You're using this very minimally. You don't want to go overboard using this kind of a pencil. This is only for those last touches to really make that contrast pop. That light next to that really, really dark, okay? Each shape that you add value to needs to have the darkest dark, and it needs to gradually change to the lightest light. Now, if this isn't light enough for you, that's where this eraser comes in. This eraser gives basically like the whiteness of the paper. I don't know if you can see, there's lines from this eraser. Those lines are not our friend. Use your finger or use a blending stump to soften those lines again. So it's a lot of back and forth. It's a lot of using different tools, and it's a lot of fun. So I hope that this was great for you guys, very informative, and just practice. The more you practice, the better you're going to get. And then eventually, once you feel comfortable with this technique without a spotlight, you can try to figure out a way to create a still life with a spotlight. And I would start only with one object until you feel really comfortable. And once you get another object in there, then this whole contrast idea becomes a little more important, and it gets a little trickier, but it definitely can be done. So you have a ways to get started, and I hope that you enjoyed this video and found it very informative. Happy drawing!